The acquisition paperwork had my company's letterhead at the top and my father's signature at the bottom. Before we get into how that signature ended up there, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your city and local time in the comments below. I love seeing where you are listening from. Now, let me take you back to a Tuesday evening in November, to a dining room in suburban Chicago, and the exact moment my father decided my future was worth sacrificing for his wife's comfort. My name is Ashley Miller. I am 39 years old. When I was 24, my father, Arthur Miller, looked at me across a mahogany dining table and told me I was cut off. Not just from his personal checking account, but from the company my grandfather had built from a single sheet metal shop in 1968. Miller Precision Manufacturing was supposed to be my life. I had spent 4 years earning a degree in industrial engineering, taking night classes in supply chain management, and working summers on the assembly line until my hands were raw and my work boots smelled like cutting fluid. My mother died when I was 12. For 6 years, it was just my dad and me. He was the kind of man who bought his trousers at Sears and calculated tips down to the exact cent. He taught me how to read a balance sheet before I learned how to drive a car. "Numbers don't tell stories, Ashley," he used to say, leaning over my middle school homework with a pencil behind his ear. "Numbers tell facts, people tell stories." Then he met Brenda. Brenda was 42 when she married my father. She came into our lives like a fresh coat of paint over dry rot. She had 3 blonde highlights, a silver Lexus with custom floor mats, and 2 teenage sons from a previous marriage who treated our house like a hotel. Within 6 months, my father was wearing linen shirts and talking about getting a boat. Within a year, he had replaced the kitchen cabinets my mother had chosen with imported Italian marble that cost more than my first year of college tuition. I didn't care about the marble. I didn't care about the boat. What I cared about was Miller Precision. I had spent 2 years after graduation working as a junior project manager in the main plant. I knew the line workers by their first names. I knew which CNC machines needed oil every 3 hours and which suppliers were padding their freight invoices. I was ready to take on real responsibility. Then came that Tuesday in November. Brenda's eldest son, Chad, had just dropped out of business school for the second time. He was 22, spent his afternoons playing video games in the basement, and owned 6 pairs of designer sneakers he paid for with my father's credit card. We were sitting at the dining table, eating a catered dinner Brenda had ordered because she didn't like the smell of cooking food in her renovated kitchen. "Arthur and I have been discussing the future of the firm," Brenda said, setting her wine glass down with a delicate clink. She didn't look at me. She looked at the centerpiece of white orchids. "We feel it's time for Chad to step into a leadership role." I paused, my fork halfway to my mouth. Chad doesn't know the difference between a lathe and a milling machine." "He has vision, Ashley," my father said. He didn't look at me either. He was staring down at his plate, cutting his steak into tiny, precise squares. "He understands modern branding. Miller Precision needs a fresh look." "Branding?" I laughed, but the sound died in my throat when I saw the expression on my father's face. "Dad, we manufacture high-tolerance aerospace fasteners. Our clients don't care about branding. They care about micron-level accuracy and on-time delivery. Chad can't even show up to dinner on time." "That's enough," Brenda said, her voice dropping into that smooth, dangerous register she used whenever she was about to get exactly what she wanted. "Arthur, tell her." My father set his knife down. The blade made a sharp scraping sound against the porcelain. "Ashley, you're being reassigned. We're opening a new sales office in Rockford. You'll be managing customer service up there." Rockford was 2 hours away. It was a glorified storage unit with a landline. It was a demotion disguised as a transfer, designed to push me out so Chad could take the office next to my father's. "And if I say no?" I asked. "Then you're done," my father said. His voice was flat, no anger, just cold administrative finality. "No salary, no access to the plant, and your grandfather's equity trust, we're restructuring it. Brenda and I agree that the capital needs to be reinvested into Chad's marketing initiative." You're taking my grandfather's trust, my voice cracked. He left that for my education and my stake in the business. Brenda leaned forward, resting her elbows on the Italian marble she'd forced into our lives. She smiled at me, the kind of smile that stops at the teeth. Ashley, sweetie, let's be honest with ourselves. You've been riding your father's coattails since you graduated. You think because you have a degree and your last name is Miller that you're owed a seat at the table. You'd never amount to anything without your father's money anyway. It's time you learned how the real world works. I looked at my father. I waited for him to speak. I waited for him to tell her that I had worked the night shifts, that I had fixed the inventory tracking system when he was too drunk on grief to come to work after my mother died, that I was his daughter. He took a sip of his wine. He didn't say a single word. I stood up from the table. I didn't yell. I didn't throw my napkin down. I walked down the hallway to my bedroom, packed one suitcase with my work clothes, picked up my laptop, and walked out the front door into the rain. I had $1,400 in my personal checking account. My company car keys were left on the hall table. My phone was on my father's corporate plan, so I left that too. I walked 3 miles to the nearest gas station, used the payphone to call a friend from college, and slept on her futon for 3 weeks. The first 6 months were a blur of cheap coffee, public library internet, and application rejections. No regional manufacturer wanted to hire the owner's daughter who had been fired from her own family's firm. The rumors spread fast in the industrial corridor around Chicago. Brenda had made sure of it. She told anyone who would listen that I had been skimming from the expense accounts, that I was emotionally unstable, that my father had no choice but to let me go. I couldn't get an interview. I couldn't get a loan. So I stopped looking for a job and started looking for a problem. Every machine shop in the Midwest had the same headache: supply chain visibility. Small-tier aerospace suppliers were still using carbon copy paper receipts, manual Excel spreadsheets, and phone calls to track custom tooling orders. If a machine went down in Ohio, a plant in Illinois wouldn't know their shipment was delayed until the truck failed to show up at the loading dock. I knew how to code basic Python from my engineering classes. I spent 14 hours a day at the public library, teaching myself real-time inventory tracking architecture. I lived on peanut butter, ramen, and the $12 an hour I earned answering phones at a local dry cleaner from 6:00 a.m. to noon. By October of my 25th year, I had a working prototype of a lightweight, cloud-based logistics platform specifically built for precision machine shops. I called it Apex Line Systems. It was crude, it was ugly, but it worked. I took the software to a small, struggling machine shop in Elgin owned by a man named Frank, who used to buy scrap metal from my grandfather. Frank's shop was losing $10,000 a month because he couldn't track his raw titanium stock accurately. "I can't pay you, kid," Frank told me, wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag as we stood next to a noisy lathe. "I don't want your money, Frank," I said, leaning in so he could hear me over the noise. "Give me 3 months. If my software saves you more than $5,000 a month in scrap reduction and lost time, you give me 5% of the savings and a written recommendation." 3 months later, Frank's scrap rate dropped by 40%. He didn't just give me the 5%. He introduced me to 4 other shop owners in the county. I worked out of a 400-square-foot office above a tire repair shop. In the winter, the radiator clanked so loud I had to mute my phone during sales calls. In the summer, the smell of hot rubber came through the floorboards until my eyes watered. But I didn't care. Every dollar Apex made went straight back into development. I hired my first developer, a soft-spoken kid from University of Illinois who worked for Equity and Cold Pizza. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on Miller Precision from a distance. It didn't take long for Brenda and Chad to make their mark. Within 18 months, Chad had hired a high-end marketing agency out of New York to redesign the company logo, bought 3 corporate BMWs for himself and his friends, and launched a brand awareness campaign that cost $300,000. What he didn't do was upgrade the machinery. He didn't maintain the client relationships. He fired 2 of the senior quality assurance inspectors because they refused to sign off on out-of-spec parts meant for a major defense contractor. My father let it happen. He was aging fast, his heart conditions catching up with him, and he was too terrified of losing Brenda to challenge her. By the time I was 30, Apex Line Systems had 50 employee clients across the Midwest. We had raised our first round of venture capital, $2 million from a firm in Boston that liked our niche focus on heavy industry. I moved out of the office above the tire shop and into a real floor in downtown Chicago. I paid myself a modest salary. I bought a small condo near the lake, and I worked. I worked 80 hours a week, every week for 10 years. Now, if you're enjoying this story so far, please leave a comment down below with the word work. It lets me know you're tracking with me, and it helps the channel immensely. Let's keep going, because the best part is coming right up. By my 37th year, Apex Line Systems wasn't just a logistics software company anymore. We had expanded into supply chain financing, equipment leasing, and automated component sourcing. We were processing over $400 million in manufacturing transactions annually. We had offices in Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. I owned 60% of the voting stock. I never called my father. He never called me. Once, when I was 34, I saw Aunt Ruth, my father's younger sister, at a grocery store in Naperville. She tried to dodge down the coffee aisle, but I caught up to her. "How is he, Ruth?" I asked softly, standing next to her cart. Ruth looked around, nervous, as if Brenda might pop out from behind the cereal boxes. "He's not good, Ashley. His heart is weak. And the business, it's hurting. Chad took on a lot of debt to fund an expansion into commercial drone parts that completely fell flat. They owe the bank millions." "Does he ever ask about me?" Ruth looked down at her hands. "Brenda told him you moved to the West Coast. She told him you were running some failed tech startup and living on credit cards. He believes what she tells him, Ashley. It's easier for him that way." I nodded. I thanked Ruth, bought my groceries, and went home. I didn't cry. I had run out of tears for Arthur Miller a decade ago. 3 years later, in the spring of present day, Apex Line Systems launched our private equity acquisition arm, Apex Industrial Holdings. Our strategy was simple: buy distressed, mid-market precision manufacturing firms that had good underlying machinery but terrible management, modernize their operations using our proprietary software, and integrate them into our regional supply network. My chief investment officer, a sharp woman named Sandra who had spent 15 years on Wall Street, brought a list of potential targets to my office on a Thursday afternoon. "We've got 5 candidates in the Great Lakes region that fit our criteria," Sandra said, sliding a thick blue folder across my walnut desk. 4 of them are standard turnaround plays. The 5th one is urgent. The primary lender is preparing to institute foreclosure proceedings within 30 days. I opened the folder. Target 5, Miller Precision Manufacturing, Inc. I looked at the balance sheet. It was a disaster. Chad had stacked 3 layers of high-interest mezzanine debt on top of a primary commercial mortgage. They had defaulted on their last 2 equipment lease payments. Their primary client, a Tier 1 automotive supplier that had been with my grandfather for 30 years, had canceled their contract due to a 15% defect rate on critical engine components. The firm was valued at less than scrap metal. They owed $6.2 million to First Midwest Bank, and the bank was done negotiating. "Do you know this company?" Sandra asked, noticing the way I was staring at the page. "I know the machinery," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat. "The main shop floor has 6 Okuma 5-axis milling centers that were installed in 2012. If those machines are recalibrated and integrated into our network, they can handle the overflow from our Detroit aerospace contract." Sandra blinked. "So, you want to place a bid?" "I don't want to place a bid, Sandra," I said, leaning back in my leather chair and looking out at the Chicago skyline. "I want to buy the debt from First Midwest Bank. Today, offer them 90 cents on the dollar for the full note. They'll take it just to clear their books before the end of the quarter. And then we call a shareholder meeting." 48 hours later, Apex Industrial Holdings was the sole holder of Miller Precision Manufacturing's debt. We owned the mortgage on the building, the liens on the machinery, and the accounts receivable. Because the company was in default, our legal team exercised our right under the loan covenants to call an emergency restructuring conference at the corporate headquarters. Which brought me back to the plant. It was a cold, rainy Thursday morning in October. The sky was the color of unpolished zinc. I drove myself to the facility in my black sedan. I didn't bring an entourage, just Sandra, two of our senior corporate attorneys, and my head of operations. I hadn't set foot on that property in 15 years. The sign out front, the one my grandfather had painted by hand in the 60s, was gone. In its place was an ugly, oversized plastic sign that read, MPM Global Tech, a Chad HARLOW enterprise. The letters were already peeling at the corners. The parking lot was full of potholes. The grass along the fence line was knee-high and dead. We walked through the front glass doors. The lobby, which used to display my grandfather's original tools in a glass case, now featured a giant framed portrait of Chad wearing a tailored suit and leaning against a sports car. The receptionist, a young girl with acrylic nails who was scrolling on her phone, barely looked up. "Can I help you?" "We're here for the 10:00 a.m. restructuring meeting in the main boardroom," Sandra said. "Oh, right." She gestured vaguely down the hall. "They're already in there. Mr. Harlow said not to disturb them unless it was important." We didn't knock. Sandra pushed the heavy oak doors open, and we walked into the boardroom. The room smelled of stale coffee, expensive cologne, and desperation. Sitting at the head of the table was Chad. He had gained 30 pounds, his hairline was receding, and his expensive suit looked wrinkled and strained. Next to him was Brenda. She had aged considerably. The skin around her mouth was tight from obvious cosmetic procedures, and her blonde highlights were brassy and overgrown. At the far end of the table, sitting in a wheelchair with a plaid blanket over his lap, was my father. He looked tiny. His hair was pure white. His skin had that translucent, waxy sheen of advanced heart failure, and his hands were trembling as he held a plastic cup of water. He didn't look like the man who had terrified me at the dining table 15 years ago. He looked like an old man waiting for a bus that was never coming. Chad didn't look up from his tablet when we walked in. "Look, if you're from the bank, I told your field officer that our Q4 projections are going to cover the interest payment. We just need a 90-day extension on the primary note." "We're not from the bank, Chad," Sandra said, stepping aside so I could walk to the center of the room. Chad raised his head, irritation clear on his face. Brenda turned her head slowly, her eyes narrowing as she squinted at me through her designer glasses. Silence fell over the room, the kind of thick, heavy silence that happens in an operating room when something goes terribly wrong. Brenda stood up first. Her chair scraped loudly against the wood floor. "Ashley." My father's hand stopped trembling. He blinked once, twice, then reached for his glasses on the table, fumbling with the frames before sliding them onto his nose. "Ashley!" His voice was barely a raspy whisper. "Hello, Dad," I said. My voice was level, measured, completely devoid of heat. "Hello, Brenda, Chad." Chad looked from me to Sandra, his face twisting in confusion. "What is this? Is this some kind of joke? Why is she here?" "Ashley is here because she is the chief executive officer and controlling shareholder of Apex Industrial Holdings," Sandra said, laying 3 thick leather-bound binders on the center of the conference table. "And as of 5:00 p.m. on Tuesday, Apex Industrial Holdings is the sole holder of all primary and secondary debt obligations for Miller Precision Manufacturing." Brenda's face went pale. The brassy blonde hair seemed to emphasize the sudden drain of color from her cheeks. "That's impossible. We're in negotiations with First Midwest." "First Midwest sold us the note, Brenda," I said, setting my briefcase on the table. "They were glad to get rid of it. They didn't think you'd survive another 30 days. And looking at your cash flow statements for the last 3 quarters, they were right." Chad slammed his hands on the table and stood up. "You can't do this. This is a family business. My mother and Arthur built this company. I turned my head and looked at Chad, just looked at him. Your mother didn't build a single thing in this building, Chad, I said softly. My grandfather laid the concrete for the shop floor in 1968. My father worked 60 hours a week here for 30 years. And you spent $3 million of their capital on marketing campaigns and luxury cars, while the CNC machines in Shop 2 were running on worn-out bearings. Arthur, Brenda turned to my father, her voice rising into that familiar, sharp pitch. Do something. Tell her she can't do this. She's your daughter. My father didn't look at Brenda. He was staring at me. His watery blue eyes were wide, taking in my tailored suit, my posture, the absolute lack of fear or anger in my expression. Ashley, he whispered, his vocal cords struggling against the oxygen tube resting in his nose. You're in Chicago. I've been in Chicago for 15 years, Dad, I said. 3 miles from the apartment where you and Mom used to take me for ice cream. She lied to you, Arthur, Brenda yelled, pointing a manicured finger at me. She's been plotting this. She wants to ruin us. I didn't plot anything, Brenda, I said, opening my binder and pulling out the acquisition agreement. I built a software company that happens to buy failing machine shops. Yours just happened to show up on my analyst's desk as a default risk. Sandra stepped forward, pulling a gold pen from her pocket and laying it on the binder in front of Chad. Here are your options, Sandra said, her voice completely businesslike. Option A. Apex exercises its right under the default covenants to foreclose immediately. We seize all physical assets, lock the doors by 2:00 p.m. today, and liquidate the machinery at auction. The company ceases to exist, and your personal guarantees on the mezzanine debt will be triggered, resulting in personal bankruptcy for both Chad Harlow and Brenda Miller. Chad swallowed hard. Sweat was visibly glistening on his forehead. And option B. Option B, I said, looking straight into my stepmother's eyes. Apex executes a debt-for-equity swap. We acquire 100% of the equity in Miller Precision Manufacturing. We assume the debt. We keep the plant open. We retain the line workers and honor their pension contributions. And us? Brenda asked, her voice cracking. What about Arthur's share? What about Chad's position? Chad is terminated immediately, I said. He has 1 hour to clear his personal belongings out of the office. He leaves the keys to the company car at the front desk. You can't fire me, Chad yelled, his face turning red. I'm the president. You were the president of a bankrupt shell, Chad, I replied. Now you're unemployed. And Arthur? Brenda asked, her voice dropping into a desperate, trembling whisper. He's sick, Ashley. He needs his medical insurance. His care costs $6,000 a month. I looked down at my father. He was looking at his hands, the same hands that used to be covered in grease and metal shavings, now soft, pale, and paper-thin. Dad's medical insurance will be covered under the corporate executive retirement plan, I said. He will receive a monthly stipend that covers his living expenses. But the house in Naperville, the one with the imported marble, is listed as collateral on Chad's mezzanine loan. You'll have to sell it to cover his personal guarantee. Brenda gasped. Sell the house? Where are we supposed to live? There's a very nice 2-bedroom rental apartment in Rockford, I said, repeating the exact words my father had used to me 15 years ago. It's near a storage unit. I hear the neighborhood is very quiet. Brenda looked at my father, waiting for him to object, to scream, to use his authority as the patriarch. My father slowly reached out his trembling hand, picked up the gold pen from the table, and looked up at me. Ashley, he rasped, his eyes filling with tears that tracked slowly down the deep lines of his face. Your grandfather. He'd be proud of you. You built this. No, Dad, I said, leaning over the table and looking him straight in the eye. I didn't build this company. I built my own. This one is just an asset I'm adding to my portfolio. My father didn't argue. He didn't defend Brenda. He didn't defend Chad. With a slow, shaky motion, he turned to the final page of the acquisition agreement, brought the pen to the paper, and signed his name on the line marked *authorized representative of the seller. The signature was shaky, the letters dragging against the white paper, but it was legal. I picked up the document, checked the date, and handed it to Sandra. "Get the locks changed on the executive offices by noon," I told her. "And tell the plant manager I want to meet with the line workers in the main bay at 1:00 p.m. I want them to know their jobs are safe." "Right away, CEO," Sandra said. I picked up my briefcase and turned toward the boardroom door. "Ashley, wait," Brenda called out, taking a step toward me. Her voice wasn't smooth or controlled anymore. It was shrill, desperate, stripped of every piece of polish she had worn for 20 years. "You can't just leave us like this. I'm your father's wife. After everything I did for this family." I stopped at the heavy oak doors, my hand on the brass handle. I turned back and looked at her brassy hair, her tight face, her ruined house, her unemployed son, and her dying husband. "You told me 15 years ago that I'd never amount to anything without my father's money, Brenda," I said softly. "You were wrong. It turns out I just needed you to take it away so I'd stop wasting my time trying to earn your seat at the table." I pushed the doors open and walked down the hallway. Behind me, I could hear the sound of the line workers in the shop floor below. The low, heavy thrum of the 5-axis milling centers cutting through solid titanium, making something strong, precise, and built to last. I didn't look back. I walked out the front doors, stepped into the cold October rain, and got into my car. The engine started with a smooth, quiet hum. I drove out of the parking lot, past the peeling sign with Chad's name on it, and merged onto the highway back to Chicago. I had a company to run. If this story reminded you that your worth is defined by what you build, not what people take from you, please leave a comment down below. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have saved his medical insurance, or would you have walked away completely? Tell me your thoughts. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, please hit that like and subscribe button for more stories like this. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.